Schubel, president of the Aquarium, and I want to welcome all of you to the spring session of our Aquatic Academy. And the topic is Thriving in the Anthropocene, a prescription for a California model. So our goal is what the title says, to come up with a prescription for how California and Californians can thrive in the Anthropocene, and to make that a prescription that could perhaps be exported to other states and maybe even other nations. Now that's a tall order, but when you look at some of the speakers we have, including the one we have tonight, Ted Nordhaus, I think it's a realistic expectation, and we're going to invite all of you to help contribute to that prescription. The prescription is going to be a brief written document. It might be as short as 1 page, both sides. It won't be any longer than 2 pages with both sides of each page. And it's going to be written so that an average person can read it and understand it, unlike the prescription your doctor gives you. And this is the first time that we've tried to do this in one of our aquatic academies. And we're going to try to do it in a timely way. And so as we go along, tonight, for example, I'm going to ask Ted what 1 or 2 things would he put in that prescription for California and Californians to thrive in the Anthropocene. So to get us started, we have to agree on a couple of terms: the Anthropocene and thriving. So the Anthropocene is defined as Earth's most recent geologic time period. It's the one in which humans are affecting and even dominating many Earth processes and phenomena. Climate for sure, but much more than climate. The hydrologic cycle, the hydrosphere, the biosphere, and so on. And we define thriving as flourishing, prospering. And if you go into Maslow's hierarchy, it would be in that top triangle. So all of your physiological needs have been met, you're safe, you have loving relationships, you have a level of self-esteem, and now you can self-actualize. If we come back to the word, the Anthropocene, the word combines anthro, meaning human, with cene, which is the standard suffix for all geologic time periods. It was proposed as a new geologic time period, and the start of it has variously been put at 10,000 years ago when agriculture began. It was put at the 1800, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and some people have put it as recently as 1950. It's not officially been designated as a new geologic epoch by the International Union of Geological Sciences. That could take decades, but it has been proposed by the Anthropocene Working Group that it should be designated as a new geologic epoch, and it was presented at the International Geological Congress in August of 2016. The most recent period of the Anthropocene has been referred to as the Great Acceleration, during which socioeconomic and Earth system trends increased dramatically, especially after World War II. And that term, the geologic, or the Great Acceleration, has been approved by the Geological Society of America. So, starting in 1945, look at this. This has 1945, 1950. Just look at I'm going to show you a few of these. Next week, we're going to look through more of these. Look what the inflection point with population, urban population, large dams, water use. So it's very clear that something dramatic happened around 1945, 1950. The word Anthropocene goes back a long way. In 1873, Antonio Stoppani referred to it as the Anthropozoic era. He was an Italian geologist, and he commented that he felt it was obvious that the effects of humans were becoming a dominant force on Earth. And in the mid-1980s, Eugene Sturmer, who was a geologist at the University of Michigan, he coined the term Anthropocene, but it never got a lot of traction into Paul Crutzen, the Nobel laureate for his work in chemistry, was at a meeting in Mexico, and somebody talked about the Holocene. That was the period that started at the end of the last glacial. And he interrupted this Congress, and he said, no, it's not the Holocene, this is the Anthropocene. And that's when it started to become accepted and widely used. So, as I mentioned, the Holocene was the last geologic period after, starting with the Ice Age, and the Anthropocene then came during that time. So both Crutzen and Sturmer maintained that things had changed so much by human activities, we needed to give this period a new name, and that they proposed the Anthropocene. And we've altered the hydrosphere, ocean acidification, sea level rise, all of these things, which we'll talk about more in other sessions. And if you look at what's happened to extinction rates, we've wiped out 50% of the world's wildlife in the last 40 years, and more than 25,000 species are known to be at risk. Now, stratigraphers, those are the geologists that study the layering of sediments, and they say that in order to have a new geologic epoch, there have to be markers in the strata that you can point to that say something changed at this period. They claim that the Anthropocene is just a term coined by a bunch of environmentalists as a buzzword. But other people have argued that if we look hard enough, we will be able to find markers in the geologic record that will go back to this period, 1945 or 1950. And the ones they propose are chicken bones. Now, there are more than 21 billion chickens on this planet. That's about 3 chickens for every person. It's far and away the most abundant bird on the planet. And I suspect if you looked at horizons that you could date after Super Bowl Sundays, although maybe not this last Super Bowl, that had to be one of the most boring Super Bowls of all time. But the others that they point to are radioactivity. There ought to be a spike in that, and also plastics, because both widespread use of plastics started about then, and radioactivity. So our working hypothesis then is that we are in the Anthropocene, and that we shall be in the Anthropocene for as long as there are humans on this planet. And the challenge is, how can we figure out how to thrive in this new geologic period? So I want you to all be clear. Those are our starting assumptions for the next 4 weeks. Now, so California is in the Anthropocene, and I think we have a long way to go before Californians, for many of us, thrive. We may have the 5th largest economy in the world, but according to the US Census Bureau, if you adjust for cost of living, California has the largest percentage of people living at or below the poverty line of any state in the nation. It's about 1 out of every 3 of us lives near the poverty line. 1 out of 3, and this is very recent information. And we have the highest homeless rate on a percentage basis outside of the District of Columbia. This is a good place to be homeless, better than Washington, D.C. because of our climate and our weather, but still, a lot of our colleagues in this state are not thriving. And you'll hear more about that in the last course from Marshall Toplansky. He's the co-author of a new report, came out a couple of months ago, called California Feudalism, the Squeeze on the Middle Class. And his argument is that the very wealthy in California are getting richer, the middle class is shrinking, and the poorer people, the underclass, is expanding quite rapidly. That's not a good sign. And next week, I think Peter Kariva will talk something about his views on that. We live in an amazing state. These are just a few of our assets. We have the greatest diversity of environments of any state in the nation. No question about it. Hottest place in the United States in Death Valley, and we have some of the coldest places. Greater diversity of climates. We have outstanding public and private universities. We've got 4 Department of Energy national laboratories, 4 out of 17. Most states would die to have one of these laboratories. We have nearly 50% of all the venture capital in the United States. And it's not even predominantly in Silicon Valley. There's much more of it around Los Angeles than there is in Silicon Valley. We have the largest agricultural economy of any state in the US. And we have the largest ocean economy of any state in the United States. And we have a remarkable creative economy. You can look at it in technology, in media, in medicine, but I would argue that when it comes to the environment, we lag in terms of having a creative environment, or at least an innovative in climate. Creativity and innovation are different. Creativity is new ideas, new combinations of ideas. Innovations is putting them into practice. And I think in too many areas, we strangle innovation because of our regulations. So, if we have all these assets, what are some of our liabilities? Cost of living, poverty, homelessness, spending on K-12 education. We spend less than half of what New York State does on K-12 education. Less than half. And we are more than $1,000 or $2,000 less than the national average. Most funding of K-12 education comes from property taxes. And we have that wonderful Prop 13. If you had your house a long time, you love it. But it's not, in some ways, it's not so good. We govern by proposition. Is that a good idea? This was something that was brought here from Switzerland, and in Switzerland, there are 1 or 2 propositions a year. In California, it's big business. It's a multi-million-dollar business. And we have this permitting, as I mentioned, that strangles innovation. It's hard in this state, in anything to do with the environment, to get to yes or to get to no. You get to maybe, and then always more studies. So over the course of the next 4 weeks, our goal is to identify the impediments and offer ways for eliminating them or at least reducing them to develop a prescription and to identify some new opportunities in this new era. And there are a lot of new opportunities, and I think many of them are in the ocean. Now, in addition to this class, all right, we'll do this next. Archimedes once said, "Give me a lever long enough and a fulcrum to place it on, and I shall move the world." We have some very important, powerful levers, and they're energy, food, and water. And I think the fulcrum that we have is the internet and global communication that allows us to communicate around the world instantaneously to form communities of action. And this is a very interesting slide. I'm not sure you can see it well enough on your notes or on the screen, but this shows how cities are going to move over the next, by 2060, I think that is. 2080, by 2080. Washington, D.C. will have a climate down here. If you look at where, in another one of these, there's Los Angeles. It will be down in the end of Baja. Just come back a sec. Can you imagine at 2080, Washington, D.C., a climate like this, we live in a very different world, and we have to acknowledge that it's a very different world, and we have to start dealing with it now. Now, in addition to all of the lecturers, we've arranged to have people who've written a number of very important books within the last several months. And I hope you'll try to come to these, and if you can't come in person, I hope you will watch them because they're all streamed live. This is Joshua Goldstein, A Bright Future. And in this book, he makes the most compelling case I have read that the only way to have rapid global decarbonization, which is what we need if we're going to curtail climate change, the only way is if we have nuclear energy play a bigger role in this future. California, we have this wonderful goal of 100% clean energy by 2045. And I was at a conference recently, and the environmentalists and the elected officials applauded that goal. The scientists and the engineers said, wait a minute. The first 60, 70, 80, even 90% is pretty easy to attain. The last 10% is complicated and it's costly. Our average electrical rates in this state are already 55% higher than the national average. And if you have an electric car, unless you have your own solar panels, when you charge that up at night, you may not know it, but you're using energy imported from Arizona and Nevada that's a mix of nuclear and fossil fuel. You've got to maintain base load, and there is no battery technology on the horizon that can do it. So we've got to have something to maintain base load. And we shut down one of our San Onofre already, and the Diablo Canyon is scheduled to close down early in 2025. I hope you'll come and hear this. It's a wonderful talk, a wonderful book. This is another one, The State of Resistance, Why California's Dizzying Descent and Remarkable Resurgence, What It Means for America's Future. This guy is a professor at USC, and he's going to be speaking on March 26th. We've tried to arrange these so they will come during this course. And then this one, we just were able to schedule. Unfortunately, we can't do it during the course, but it's a fabulous book about water globally and some emphasis in California and the United States. And this is going to be May 30th. So we hope again that you will come and hear that. This is the one I mentioned, California Feudalism, Joel Kotkin and Marshall Toplansky, and Toplansky will give the last class in this course. So these opportunities, I think, food, water, energy, and the ocean economy. These are all areas of opportunity in this new Anthropocene for California. California is the leading producer. 50% of all the fruits and vegetables in the United States come from California, but agriculture uses 70% of all of our developed water and maybe more. Energy, I already mentioned what's happening with our energy. And the ocean economy, we have the largest ocean economy of any state in the United States. The top three sectors are travel and tourism, number one. Number two is shipping and transportation, and here we are in the city of the home of one of the two major seaports in the country. And the third one is offshore mineral recovery, and the minerals in this case are offshore oil. In the ocean economy, of those three, by the end of the century, one of them will be gone entirely, one of them will be severely compromised, and only one will be thriving. The offshore oil, all these offshore platforms have a remaining lifetime of about a decade. Now, it depends to some extent on the price of oil, but it's the order of a decade. And this aquarium has been asked to have a forum on what to do with these rigs after they no longer are producing oil. And we're going to be doing that in December. There are a lot of choices. You can decapitate them so that ships can run over them. You can take them out entirely. You can tip them over. Or you could repurpose some of them. For example, you could have one of them be a hub for offshore aquaculture. In some places, they have built prisons on them in other countries. That's not California. I don't think we would do that. They've built luxury hotels because they're great diving sites, because the life on these towers sometimes exceeds the weight of the structures themselves. But there are some opportunities for us to look at these. Travel and tourism, it depends upon having great beaches and great surf. We will still have great surf. But if you look at sea level rise, and if you read California's fourth climate assessment, it makes it very clear that if we have only moderate reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and if you look at the sea level rise scenario that goes with that, our beaches will be severely compressed, and most of them will be gone in our wetlands by 2100 unless we intervene and do something quite dramatic. Can you imagine the surf city of the United States, Huntington Beach, with no surf? It's hard to imagine. We need to begin to think about all of these things and what we can do. And we have with us tonight Ted Nordhaus. Ted is the president of the Breakthrough Institute. You have his bio in your notes, and I would have to say that Ted and some of his colleagues at the Breakthrough Institute have been among the leaders in trying to get people to think differently about the future and the ways that we can use technology and knowledge. There's this debate, can we create a good Anthropocene? And Ted and his colleagues have been working on that. We can darn sure create a better Anthropocene at least, and that's what we're going to focus on in this course for the next 4 weeks. So please join me in welcoming Ted Nordhaus.
Well, I was going to start by asking if anyone here knows what the Anthropocene is. But Jerry did a great job of explaining it. So now, if you didn't know starting out, you do know now. So I'm going to cover 3 things tonight. The first is about the ways in which California's temperate and hospitable environment isn't actually natural at all. The second is what the Anthropocene, and more specifically, a changing climate means for California today and going forward. And the third is going to be about some of the things that we will need to do to assure that we do have a good Anthropocene in California in the 21st century. So let's start by talking about the California dream. A lot of the reasons that so many of us come to California is because it's such a beautiful place. Amazing beaches, spectacular cities, Golden Gate, Yosemite. We come to California for the great weather, for the beautiful environment. The idea is that anything is possible on the edge of the continent and in a place where so many people have come to find a better life. But California wasn't always this way. So here's that same view. It's a rendering from the 19th century, and obviously you can't exactly compare it because I showed you a pretty color photo originally. But what's important to note here is just how little vegetation there is. It does not actually feel quite like you're in a desert here. This isn't the welcoming sort of California dream that so many of us grew up with or came here to find. Consider California, San Francisco. Much of the San Francisco peninsula was a harsh and wind-swept plain. There were virtually no trees and no protection from the wind and fog in the 19th century, much less earlier. This is the Golden Gate before they built the bridge. When you really think about it, and I actually look at this view with the bridge from my home in the Berkeley hills every morning. But in some ways, it's actually much more spectacular with a bridge there than without the bridge. It's the bridge that actually turns that into this iconic California vista. Yosemite, we think about Yosemite as a pristine natural wonder, but it was a working landscape. It was farmed and ranched for many centuries before John Muir showed up and claimed the valley for nature. And really the same is true all over the state. We drained wetlands and filled bays all over the state to create desirable places for people to live and work. And here you can see, this is a before and after 1848 to 1994, how much of the San Francisco Bay was either wetlands that were drained or areas that were filled. The bay, as we know it, has been completely transformed. The Central Valley, too, was a vast wetland and waterway. These are, on the left, you see images from the Great Flood of 1862, when Sacramento was under about 20 feet of water for most of the winter and spring. And you can see in the other image here how much of the Central Valley flooded. You could sail a boat or row a boat from end to end during the course of that winter without ever hitting or even seeing land. And the point here is that California's environment, which is the thing that has drawn so many of us here over so many decades, isn't a natural thing. It was created by us. It was created by the people of California over about 150 years. Sorry, that's another. So that was the past. So let's take a little bit of time now to talk about the future. We know that the climate is changing, and that it's going to create new challenges at the intersection of a growing population and a changing economy. And you might have heard that the California dream is dead, but apparently a lot of people didn't get the message. Because the state's population continues to grow. In fact, current projections suggest that the state's population could top 50 million people by 2050. And it's true, even as that growing population has created a lot of new pressures and challenges, California's quality of life, at least for many people, remains very, very high. Its economy continues to be a magnet for people all over the world. So you have this dynamic that Jerry alluded to, which is that on the one hand, you have people really struggling. It's gotten so expensive to live here. And on the other hand, you have people from all over the country and all over the world who want to move here and live here. And this is what urbanists call agglomeration effects. That sort of the more people come here, the more people want to be here for both sort of social and cultural and economic reasons, even as it gets harder and harder to live here. And that's not going to change. So the first challenge that we face going forward in the Anthropocene is, wait a minute, where are all these people going to live? Will it be dense, transit-friendly cities, sprawling suburbs, tent cities? Right now, it's all of the above. And the reality is that the state is not building nearly enough housing to keep up with demand. And that has made housing unaffordable for a large share of the state's population. Just to give you a sense of that, some standard rule of thumb for what an affordable housing is about 30% or so of a household's income. 20% of California households today pay over 50% of their income in housing. That's an extraordinary figure. And even as the changing climate is increasing hazards of fire and floods and inundation, people are moving toward the hazard, not away from it. So you can see here, population is growing faster in the fire zones of Southern California than anywhere else. Even after all these crazy fires we've had, that's continuing. And the same is true all over the state. I live in the fire zone up in the Berkeley Hills. I know as much as anyone about the risks I take. I live surrounded by oak trees. It's like a tree house. But I have no plans to move, and neither do most people, because there's quality of life factors that bring people into these places. And the same is not only true of the fire zone, but it's true of flood zones. It's true of the areas that are going to be inundated by sea level rise as well. So we have a set of challenges around building enough housing, and then a set of other challenges around where we're building the housing. We're going to have to figure out how to deal with those issues. Second, we're going to need to figure out how to move all of those people around, even as transportation remains far and away the largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in the state. Everyone in my world spends lots of time arguing about what to do about the electrical grid and how you're gonna, how much renewables, nuclear, other things. But in California, the main event is transportation, and maybe we'll solve some of that with electrification, but that's gonna be a long road way to go. And we just have been unable to build, again, in the same way that we haven't been able to build enough housing, we haven't been able to build enough infrastructure to keep up with the growing transportation demand. Third, rainfall is going to become increasingly more variable. Sometimes we'll get more of it, like this year. Sometimes we'll get less of it. So we're going to have both more droughts and more floods. And overall, we won't necessarily have less water, but it's going to come at different times and in different places, and we're going to have to figure out how to get it to where we need it, and also how to leave some of it for the environment. This is the, you all are probably familiar with this. This is the Oroville Dam overflowing and its spillway disintegrating in the heavy rain year a couple of years ago. And when you look at years like this, there's a lot of reason to think that we just do not have anything like the water infrastructure that we need to handle these changes. Now, before I move on for water, I want to actually address two sort of myths about California water. The first is that the drought threatens to make California a place that can't support its population. And that's just simply not true. Almost all of the water in the state, 70–80%, as Jerry mentioned, is used by agriculture. Agriculture represents 2% of the state's economy, also about 2% of employment. So if water is scarce, it's not cities or the tech and service economies that are going to lose out. It's going to be agriculture and the environment. But in terms of the real sort of social and economic consequences, the consequences of water scarcity in California aren't going to be actually faced by California. They're going to be faced by the rest of the country because we produce all their food, certainly all the fresh produce. 40% of fresh produce in the United States is grown in California. During times of year like this, it's much more than that. And for all sorts of specialty crops, it's actually close to 100%. So the next time you see a big spread in like the New York Times about how next big drought year, every time there's a big drought in California, there's a New York Times series of articles about how California is going to dry up and blow away. No, that's not going to happen. What's going to happen is they're going to pay a lot more for their fresh fruits and vegetables. The second myth is that in response to water scarcity, farmers will switch to more water efficient crops, crops that need less water. That's not actually what happens. What happens is they switch to higher value crops. The water becomes, they have less water, often it becomes a lot more expensive. So they're going to switch to crops that are more valuable. So what we see actually is farmers switching from a very water intensive, low value crop like alfalfa to a very water intensive, high value crop like almonds. And this is how farmers are going to survive in a water scarce environment. It's actually going to be by figuring out how to make more money off the water that they use, and then they'll sell some of it to other people, things like that. Finally, and Jerry stole some of my thunder in this talk, but I expected it. Finally, as the state attempts to move to lower carbon energy, there are going to be a lot more conflicts over land use and energy, and also who pays the high cost of low carbon energy. So already, California has the highest, among the highest electricity costs, retail electricity costs in the country. That will only go up as we increase the amount of variable renewable electricity that the state uses. And as we scale that renewable energy up, I mean, we hear lots about rooftops and everyone's going to have solar panels on their rooftop. I have solar panels on my rooftop. That is not where we're going to get much of our renewable energy. It's going to be big industrial scale solar and wind farms. You see the Ivanpah farm out in the Mojave Desert there. And that is just creating huge land use conflicts today between solar and wind developers, environmentalists who care about the desert and desert biodiversity and habitats, and also communities who in many cases aren't wild about all of the wind and solar development they're experiencing, and then also all the transmission. When you build all that, the places that it tends to be best to build these kind of things are a long way away from where we use it. So you not only have to site these huge facilities, but you also have to then move all of that electricity from where it's being generated to where it's needed across very large distances. And that's really different than the way that the electrical system has historically worked, where a lot of your electricity was being generated by a plant. You know, you can build a coal plant theoretically just about anywhere. A little harder with a nuclear plant. Gas plant, even easier to build almost anywhere. These facilities have to be built a long way away in a lot of cases, and you have to move the electricity a very long distance to get it to where it's needed. And because of that, you see San Bernardino, many of you may have seen this, is now proposing to ban large solar projects in the county for a period of time because they've decided they've had enough. So then what will it take for California to adapt well in the Anthropocene? And that's going to require us to rebuild the state for a changing climate and a much larger population. So the first thing we're going to have to do is figure out how to build a lot more housing, not a little bit more, a lot more. And there's big arguments going on right now between housing advocates. Some say we need to densify, have really dense cities with multi-story development, and others say we need to build more suburbs where it's more affordable for people to live. People want, you'll hear from Joel Kotkin's colleague who says, no, it's just sort of this natural thing that people want a yard, they want more space, they don't want to live in these dense, be cooped up in these dense cities. Some say we need to get rid of zoning and environmental restrictions so we can build much more housing much faster. Other people say we need to build a lot more subsidized housing. And in reality, the housing shortfall is so great in this state, we're probably going to have to do all of the above. So more density in cities and more suburban development on the perimeter, more market rate housing, and more below market rate housing. And we probably, beyond that, need to actually really think out of the box. This is in China and India, they're building, they call them new cities. They're literally like, it's not like go and kind of make a city that's already pretty dense, even denser. It's literally like go out into a green field, farms and pastures and whatever, and just kind of stake out a big area. And they're building cities of 500,000, 1 million people even. And that's, we go, well, that's crazy. But when you actually look at how much new housing we are going to need to build in this state if we want housing to be affordable, it's an extraordinary amount of housing. And we just published in our journal an article calling for creating habitat reserves for people, places where you're just going to kind of build just a ton of housing, all market rate, whatever the market will bear, but you can build as much as you want, you can build as high as you want. put it out, build a transit link or a highway or whatever, just put it out somewhere where you can just go build. You can start from scratch. We're going to need to rebuild the state's plumbing system, as a lot more of our precipitation is going to come as rain instead of snow as the climate warms. And again, when you have all of it historically, which much of it has been snow, you get free storage. It sits up there in the Sierras, it slowly melts, it runs off, you build the reservoirs, you move it around, you do what you need to do with it. Well, when that's falling as rain, you either capture that water or you lose it. And you're going to have to control it because otherwise it's going to flood a lot of places. So we're probably going to have to build a lot of what people call off-stream storage to store water. Historically, we build these dams on rivers, and then we kind of hold the water there and then we kind of let it out. But increasingly, I think a lot of folks think that we're going to have to build a lot of storage sort of off-stream, sort of dry valleys, things like that, where you're going to pump the water in and out. And we're also probably going to need to do a fair amount of desalination, a topic that I know is near and dear to Jerry's heart. This is the Carlsbad desalination facility. But obviously, one way we solve our water problem, we've got the huge amount of water just right offshore. The key with desalination is it takes energy. And a lot of the things we're talking about here, actually, you can do them technologically, you can solve them, but you need energy. And so if you're going to do that in a way that's not going to make climate change a lot worse, you're going to need clean energy. We're going to have to figure out how to build transportation infrastructure again, because it's really become very expensive, hard to build. I think there are generally 3 rules of thumb for transportation infrastructure. The first is beware of mega projects. If nobody has ever built it before, it's probably going to be really expensive to be the first one to build it. And you can see here California's high-speed rail and the eastern span of the Bay Bridge up in Northern California are pretty good examples of this. So off-the-shelf proven technology will almost always be the best way to go. The second rule is that it's a lot more expensive to retrofit infrastructures to places that have already been built than it is to build infrastructure after a city or a community has already been built. And so if you go back to that slide I show you and this idea of sort of new cities, I mean, right now what we have mostly done in the post-war era is we've built a lot of greenfield development, stuff out on the periphery where it's just much easier to build stuff when there's nothing there. And the problem is that we built it all very low density. So I think one of the key things is going to be, can we sort of solve some of these problems by building new communities and basically planning in advance and planning for growth as we build the infrastructure, because it's just much easier to build infrastructure before all the people and all the activity is there than it is to do it after it's all there. Energy, critical. We're going to need to deeply cut our emissions. And we're going to need to do that in a way that's affordable. And that, if you care about places like the California desert, we're going to have to do that in a way that doesn't have huge land use impacts. And certainly our view has been that you need an all of the above low carbon approach. So we'd be a lot closer to our clean energy goals in California if we hadn't closed San Onofre, if we weren't planning to close Diablo. That doesn't mean we need to run the entire state on nuclear energy, but we'd have a base of low carbon electricity that was always on. You can actually ramp it up and down to a fair amount, to a much larger degree than people think, to match the changes in the variability in renewable energy demand. So we think that, and California's just taken a very important step in this direction in that it has transitioned what was historically called a state renewables portfolio standard, which was only renewables, and it was 20%, and then it went to 30%, and then it went to 50%, and they wanted to go to 100%, and sort of a whole lot of folks in the state, a whole lot of labor, business, the utilities themselves, everyone said, whoa, that's not going to work. That's crazy. We can do clean energy, but we can't do 100% renewables. So they basically shifted and said, we're going to go to 100% clean energy, but up to 40% of that can be non-renewable clean energy. So that could be nuclear energy, it could be fossil fuel plants that capture and store their carbon, it could be geothermal, there's a number of other options. But that is actually where we'll need to go. We need to make clear that the objective here is not renewable, it's not wind or solar, it's zero carbon. If you care about climate change, that's what you have to care about. Finally, if we care about nature and biodiversity, we're going to need to decide what we want and where we want it. So today in California, we're simultaneously abandoning land and converting it to housing or for housing. You can see on the right over there, that's a map of Northern California showing all of the low density ex-urban housing that's being developed in rural parts of Northern California. But this is happening all over the state. 2, 3, 4 acre lots. People want to kind of get out into nature. And at the same time, we're pulling back from nature. As agriculture has become more efficient, we're abandoning marginal agricultural lands. Forestry, we've also what we call decoupled increasingly fiber production from economic growth. So we're getting more and more efficient at producing fiber. And as we've done that, we just need less and less land for production to produce timber for wood and other fibers. So we've got all this land all over the state that's being abandoned because people don't want to live there. And we don't need it for timber or agriculture anymore. And so what's happening now is a sort of what's called, where is it? There's translation, somewhere here. Passive rewilding, which just kind of like no one's planning or managing anything. It's just whatever comes back and shows up, and you have these, people call them novel ecosystems. But there's also a lot of conversation that we can do more than that. So, we can have just lots of turkeys and deer if we want, or we can have elk and wolves and grizzlies if we want. We could even maybe have woolly mammoths if we want that. And, that's the thing about, excuse me, it's the thing about life in the Anthropocene, is that we actually get to decide a lot of this. So when we think about what sort of nature we want in California, it's a choice. We get to make that choice. And it's not just about sort of setting this land or that land aside, but it's also about sort of what assemblages of vegetation and species we want and what we want to manage versus not manage. So a whole set of really important questions for the parts of the state that we, even with 50 million people, we're probably not going to use. So in closing, I want to just ask you all a question, which is, when you kind of go through all those things, what do most of those things have in common in terms of when you talk about the solutions, the things that we gonna need to do in this century going forward? Any ideas?
Like they take energy.
That's definitely one.
Massive infrastructure.
Infrastructure, yeah, absolutely. Other ideas? Yeah.
Water conservation,
Mm-hmm.
and also technology around batteries to be able to store this energy efficiently
Mm-hmm.
with enough energy density to be able to hit economies of scale.
Yeah, all of those get a part of it. They're all generative, and I don't mean that in just energy generating. They all require leaning into our environmental future and not withdrawing from the environment and from nature. And they require us to actually say yes to a bunch of things, not no. And that's been a hard thing for a lot of environmentalists to do, because historically the environmental kind of sort of mindset has been, no, stop development. stay out. We're going to draw a big circle around a beautiful place, and the people are going to stay out of it. Don't build that thing. Don't do this. Don't do that. But when you look at what actually California is going to have to do to allow 50 million people by the middle of this century to thrive in this state while we protect our environment and maintain the things that have made California an amazing place to live, we got to build things. We got to say yes to things. We got to make decisions and say we're going to build it, and it's not going to be perfect, and there's going to be trade-offs. But we got to decide, we got to make some decisions about our future and invest in that future. And that means all of the things you mentioned. It means new housing, yes to housing, yes to infrastructure, yes to new reservoirs, yes to new energy development. And we can argue about whether it's going to be wind turbines or nuclear power plants, but you're going to have to do something if you want it to be clean, because the coal plants and the gas plants aren't going to become clean all by themselves, and neither are the cars. But that's what it's going to require to assure that California continues to be a natural wonder and a desirable place for us all to live. So thank you all. Thank you, Jerry, for having me. It's been great to be here. And I'm looking forward to having a conversation.